They called him useless old man. No child, no wife, no reason to stay on that scorched red earth. For 8 years, Tobias Redmont lived alone, beside an empty chair and a scar no one dared to ask about. Until one day, 10 Apache women knocked on his door. And this time, he didn't turn them away. At the end of a dry red dirt road, where the weeds grew slanted like dulled blades that had long since lost their reason to stay sharp, sat a weathered cabin, sunken into the scorched light of the western desert. Tobias Redmont lived there, alone, no friends, no dog, no kin, not even a memory he dared to call by name. Folks in town spoke of him with a kind of cruelty that was half tradition, half habit. The leftover man. A ghost in the dry brush. That one-eyed wreck who ain't got no use. They whispered that he was no man anymore, just a husk dragging itself through the red dust, mumbling to the wind like it carried the voices of the dead. One swore they'd seen him light 2 hand-rolled cigarettes and leave one burning in a cracked porcelain ashtray, like he was waiting for someone who'd never come back. But no one got close enough to ask. Mornings at his cabin didn't start with rooster calls or far-off church bells. They began with the whine of wind slipping through rusted tin and the shuffle of worn-out boots dragging across a floor that had forgotten how to hold warmth. Tobias rose before the sun, as though the dawn owed him an explanation. He boiled water in a tarnished brass kettle, measured 2 level spoons of coffee. No more, no less. And poured it into 2 cloudy porcelain bowls. One for himself, one left to cool on the windowsill, beside a scrap of Apache leather etched with an eagle, an old gift he had never thrown away. No one asked why. Some guessed a wife gone, a child never born, or just a habit as brittle and dry as he was. Truth was, Tobias didn't know anymore. He only knew that if someone ever did knock, he didn't want to be seen fumbling for a clean bowl. The town lay just a few miles down the hill, but he only went once a month for cough syrup, baling wire, and sandpaper. No one said hello. No one looked up. They avoided him the way folks avoid a sour wind that carries the stink of something already dead. Tobias walked past them like a wisp of dust, quiet, unwelcome, forgotten before his boots crossed the threshold. Once a milk-lipped boy shouted, "He used to blow up mountains with dynamite. Now he just blows up noses with mold." The father didn't scold, only smirked. Tobias didn't turn, but his fingers clenched the canvas strap until the thread split, his palm hot as desert sand. His shack was a patchwork of broken things, splintered wood, rusted nails, canvas gone blotchy from sun and storm. No paintings, no plants, just a cracked mirror nailed near the window, reflecting a face that once belonged to someone. Now only the ghost of that man remained. Each dusk he'd sit out on the porch watching the dirt road nobody traveled, like it owed him a promise from before his heart turned to dust. No one came, but every morning he brewed 2 bowls of coffee, one for himself, one for the name no one knew, and he lived like that. No knock on the door, no voice calling his name, no one who needed him. He told himself that was enough. Until one night of rain. The wind carried a knocking, not polite, not forceful, just steady, like the heartbeat of someone who'd knocked on too many doors that never opened. Tobias looked at the wooden door as if it might speak. His hand touched the gun hanging on the wall, then pulled back, not out of faith, only because for the first time in 8 years he wanted to know who was desperate enough to come looking for someone like him. Outside, the wind screamed under the eaves like it always did, but now, tangled in that scream, was the breath of the living. The knocking came again, not louder, not faster, but still there, as if the one outside no longer had the strength to plead. but would not accept being left behind. Tobias didn't open the door right away. He only stood there, back slightly stooped, eyes fixed on the faded wood, ears listening for that silence between rain and breath. The rain pounded the roof like hurried footsteps in pursuit, but the knocking was different. It had a rhythm, not the rhythm of desperation, but of someone who had knocked on many doors and been answered by none. His hand reached for the bolt, cold steel, wet and rusted, like a part of himself long buried beneath 8 years of unnamed fear. And in that moment a voice echoed in his mind. Not a hallucination, but a memory. If someone comes knocking when the wind sounds like it did the night your daddy died, don't let them die from being ignored, Toby. Sarah's voice. She'd said it the first night they moved into this shack, when their daughter was 7, before the war came knocking on their own door. It had been a long time since Tobias let a memory speak aloud. Longer still since he let himself remember Sarah as someone still living. The knocking stopped, gone. Only the rain remained, and the wind slapping against the door like it always had. Then, something quieter, so soft you wouldn't hear it unless you were used to listening through loneliness. A breath, and a whisper, in a language he once knew. Apache. Tobias froze. Every part of him went still, because that voice, that language, was the last thing he'd heard before his wife and daughter died. Back then, when the railroad cut through the borderlands, Tobias had been the one laying dynamite through the mountains. A company of soldiers escorted the route, some of whom had said, "Don't trust the Redskins, not even when they offer you a hand." He hadn't argued, but he hadn't objected either. That night, the men broke out liquor. A few soldiers disappeared for hours. By morning, the Apache camp across the river was in ashes, and his daughter, 9 years old, was missing. Sarah found her at the foot of the hill, still clutching the wooden doll carved from bark, a gift from an Apache girl. After that, Tobias never spoke another word to anyone in uniform. He resigned, disappeared, bought this stretch of barren land, and walled it all off, with silence. Now that language had returned, not from an enemy, but in a woman's voice. Soft, but steady, not afraid, just asking. Tobias didn't open the door, but he didn't walk away either. He stood there as if staring at something without shape or name, a conscience, a wound reopened, or maybe just a longing for someone long gone. He turned back to the stove, poured more water into the old brass kettle, set 2 porcelain bowls on the table, like every morning, but this time he filled them both, one for himself and one for the soul who hadn't yet stepped inside, but had already pulled his from the dark. On the windowsill, steam curled from the coffee like an unspoken invitation. And outside, the knocking did not return, only the rain, easing into a whisper, and a silence between 2 souls who had not yet seen each other, but had already touched, through the simple, stubborn fact of still being alive. Night settled in, though not in full darkness. The moon was veiled behind thick clouds, its light seeping through like blood-soaking linen, just enough to glimpse what was slowly fading away. Tobias added wood to the fire, not for the cold, but because he didn't want a single soul in that house to shiver. Not tonight. The young girl had drifted to sleep beside the stove, the child pressed to her chest, her head leaning against the wooden wall. The elder woman's breath came in raspy pulls, but steady, like desert wind that never truly rests. Ayana sat with her back to a post, eyes open, her gaze deep as a well dug into dry country. Not pleading, not asking, just waiting. Tobias felt her eyes like a stone of red sandstone placed in his palm. Not heavy, but impossible to ignore. He stepped into the back room, where the old ebony chest lay beneath a covering of burlap and dust. 8 years it had stayed closed. Never locked, but heavy, as if it had buried the weight of a whole life. He brushed off the dust and opened the lid. Inside were the broken pieces of a man who once lived. A photograph of 3, Tobias, Sarah, and the little girl. Its edges yellowed, one corner torn. A dagger with Sarah's name carved into the hilt, the blade still sharp as the day he'd given it to her, a cloth embroidered with an Apache eagle. A gift from a native friend he'd once saved, now long turned to ashes in memory. Tobias had once been the man who laid dynamite through the mountain passes so the railroad could cut through the frontier. He knew that 1 inch off meant a life gone, and he knew too that some explosions make no sound, but collapse the last part of your soul still standing. The night Sarah died, he was in the military camp, checking charges for the next train. Their daughter, 9 years old, had followed her mother into the woods, searching for the Apache who'd been attacked. The soldiers said savages brought it on themselves. Tobias hadn't argued, but he hadn't stopped them either. The next morning, a young soldier brought the girl's body back, eyes open wide, arms locked around the wooden doll. A gift from the Apache girl who once taught her a desert song. Sarah found her at the base of the hill, cold, her neck bruised, deep purple. No one was punished. The officers called it combat collateral. Sarah didn't weep. She walked into the forest, took off her wedding ring, and left it beneath an old pine. 3 days later, she collapsed from fever and exhaustion, still clutching a lock of their daughter's hair. Tobias left everything, no court, no justice. He bought this barren patch of land, built the shack, dug a well, planted crops that refused to grow, raised horses that never foaled. He built a place no one wanted to visit, so no one would ask him to explain. And now, with 10 women quietly warming themselves in this cabin, not asking, not judging, Tobias no longer saw that chest as a tomb for the past. He closed it lightly, as if shutting a book he had long feared to reopen, not to forget, but to acknowledge that from this night forward, he might still write one more chapter. He stepped back into the room. Ayanna remained where she sat. Her eyes didn't ask. Her mouth didn't speak. Tobias gave a nod, uncertain whether to her or to himself. The fire still burned. The wind still howled outside. But in his chest, the cold had retreated to a corner, making room for the faintest light, like moonlight, piercing cloud. Midnight. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers. The rain had long since stopped, but the air still held the smell of mud, smoke, and the cold dampness of human hair. Tobias lay on a thin mattress near the front door. Not quite a bed, just a slab of wood covered with an old blanket. He wasn't asleep, only breathing slow and even, as if listening for something that hadn't arrived yet, something he wasn't ready to name. Ayanna sat with her back to the center post, eyes open. She hadn't slept since the moment she stepped inside. She wasn't standing guard. She wasn't waiting. She wasn't watching for anything. She was watching within, like someone who had survived more nights of rain than times she'd been asked, "Are you all right?" The baby began to wheeze. The young girl held it closer, pressed her ear to its chest. Tobias rose. No light, no noise. He walked across the room and handed her a dry cloth, kept in a tin box all these years, unused. No one said thank you, but the way her eyes met his hand was enough to make Tobias feel like he wasn't just a forgotten shadow. He had just returned to his mattress when it came, hoofbeats, distant, uneven, but real. Tobias lifted his head, not startled, just listening. He knew that sound better than his own heartbeat. In his younger days, he could count horses by the rhythm of their gait. And this time, he heard at least 4, heavy, urgent, not carrying freight, carrying men. Ayanna was already on her feet. She didn't ask Tobias a word. She stepped to the window, peering through a crack in the wood, just wide enough for a fingertip. The wind shifted. It carried the scent of smoke, not from the fire inside, but from a camp farther off, beyond the tree line, where soldiers burn with oil and ash. Tobias spoke almost as if exhaling. "They're not townsfolk." Ayanna nodded. The elder woman rose slowly, not afraid, not complaining. She placed a hand on the shoulder of the girl, holding the child, then moved quietly to the back, to where Tobias once stored his shovel and spade. No one had to say a thing. Everyone in that room had lived through enough loss to understand peace never lingers, and the good don't get to run forever. Tobias stepped to the door. His hand paused on the iron bolt. It was colder than usual, not from the weather, but from the weight of the choice waiting behind it. 8 years ago, on a night like this, same rain, same hoofbeats, he hadn't left his tent. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't stood up. By morning, he'd lost both wife and child. Now the same wind, the same footsteps, but he was on the other side of the door, and behind him were 10 women, none of them kin, but all of them somehow the final measure of whether he could still be called a man. Tobias didn't open the door, but he drew the bolt and laid it against the wall, a wordless declaration. Ayanna looked at him, no nod, no smile. She only tightened the cloth wrapped around her hand. That small, hollow motion carried in it more trust than Tobias had believed anyone would ever give him again. Wind pushed through the doorframe, carrying footfalls, not rushed, not loud, but just loud enough to know those who come without light often bring only death. The door opened, just a crack wide enough for Tobias to step through. The wind still tore along the side of the house, as if the land itself couldn't bear anyone standing still too long. The sky hung pale, moonlight stretched thin and crooked behind layers of cloud, just enough to make out the shapes of 10 people huddled near the edge of the porch. They stood in an uneven line, as if each one was the end of a story left unfinished. Mud clung to their legs up to the knees. Their clothes were streaked red-brown. Some stains were fresh. Everyone's hair was wet. Everyone's eyes were open. But Tobias saw only one thing: the child, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, so worn its original color had long vanished. The girl holding it was so young, Tobias felt his chest tighten, watching her cradle the infant's head with both palms, as if she were holding fire in a storm. The child's face was ghostly pale, not the pale of flesh, but of mist, when life clings to breath and breath alone. Tobias had never been one to soften. He had stepped over bodies on the battlefield, had set charges with shaking hands, blood dripping from cuts. He never paused to dress. But now, before this child, not sleeping but fighting to breathe like a coal refusing to go out, something tore gently in his chest. Not pain, memory. His daughter, at birth, had been this small. Sarah once said, "Every child is a thread tying you back to whatever part of your soul you've still got left." When their daughter died, Sarah cut every thread, and Tobias, he buried the hand that once held the scissors. Now another thread trembled before him. No one asked him to take it, but he knew if he didn't hold on, it would break, and he'd lose the last chance he might ever have. Tobias stepped forward, lighter than he thought his body could move. Saying nothing, he knelt down and pulled off his scarf, the thick one he'd kept through every winter. He didn't ask, didn't wait. He wrapped it around the child, tight, warm, as if shielding the last fragile thing in a world already half lost. The girl froze just for a breath, like she wanted to speak, then only bowed her head, low and long. Ayanna looked at Tobias, for the first time, not as a stranger, but as if he'd been chosen long before this night. No one spoke. Inside, the elder woman opened the door wide. One arm went around the young girl's shoulders. The other gently reached for the child. They stepped in, not with haste, not stomping on the floor like people fleeing. They moved like shadows who knew where the fire still lived. Tobias remained on the porch, alone, eyes fixed on the red dirt road with no footprints. The night stretched on. The wind kept blowing, but in his chest, something stirred. A quiet cry, not from the throat, but from the place where he'd buried his heart 8 long years ago. The baby was placed near the stove, not in a bed, not in a cradle, but on a makeshift layer of towels folded from old shirts, frayed blankets, and the very scarf Tobias had kept since the days Sarah was still alive. The fire crackled softly, and now, still burning with the wood Tobias had split a month ago. The glow cast shadows on the walls, illuminating the face of a child smaller than 2 hands cupped together. It didn't cry, didn't open its eyes, only breathed. And in every fragile breath, Tobias felt as if he were being called, named even, for the first time in 8 long years without the sound of another soul. The young girl, the one who had carried the baby all this way, sat slumped against the wall, hollows beneath her eyes, hands gently rubbing her knees. The eldest woman wrapped an old sweater around her shoulders, then sat beside her in silence. Ayanna remained standing back against the post. She looked at Tobias, not with gratitude, but as if waiting to see whether he would step forward again or retreat into the shadow he had worn for so long. Tobias fetched water. He didn't ask who needed it, didn't offer it with words, didn't explain. He poured it into a tin bowl, brought it over, and set it before the young woman. Then in front of the child. No one reached for it, no one ate, but in a house warmed by breath and being, every gesture was seen and remembered. Tobias sat near the stove, or where he always sat alone, but now the seat felt smaller, the room tighter, and his heart no longer crowded. The baby stirred, its breathing grew heavier, a sound slipped out, not a cry, but a dry catch from the throat. The girl leaned in, quickly, gently. Ayanna stepped forward, placed her hand over the child's chest. No one shouted, no one panicked. Only hands moved, the kind that had learned how to mother, even if they'd never borne a child. Tobias felt his own hand move. He took a cloth, dipped it in water, wrung it out carefully, and passed it to Ayanna. She accepted it. No surprise, no thanks, as if she'd known there would come a moment when he would cross into the circle of those who still dared to touch the living. The baby breathed evenly again, eyes still shut, but its lips had lost their blue. That tiny belly rose and fell beneath the layered cloth, each movement like the heartbeat of something slowly returning to a house that had once gone still with death. Tobias turned away, not out of shame, but because something stung behind his eyes, and he was not used to crying where others could see. Sarah once said, "A child doesn't need a miracle, just someone who'll stay long enough for them to grow." Tobias remained near the fire for a long while, saying nothing, not leaving, not because he knew what to do, but because this time he understood. He wouldn't let anyone be alone again, not even a child who hadn't yet learned to cry. Outside, the wind picked up once more, and far off, the fall of a horse's hoof missed a beat, like a question suspended in the night. And for the first time in his life, Tobias didn't turn away. He stood, walked to the door, placed his hand on the iron latch, didn't shut it, didn't open it further, just held it still, like a promise. The wind fell still, not because the world had changed its mind, but because everything that was about to happen was holding its breath. The hoofbeats stopped, no rush, no retreat, no trumpet, just silence, as if the men outside were straining to hear something inside their own shadows. Tobias sat on the porch step, didn't raise his rifle, didn't hide. He simply existed, One figure broke away from the riders, walking toward the house. The lantern's light swung across a long coat, a low-brimmed hat. No badge, no name tag. But Tobias recognized it instantly. The posture of a soldier, the shape of someone who knew how to shoot, but not how to speak. The man stopped 3 paces from the fence, didn't cross it, didn't hurry. "Mr. Redmont?" A hoarse voice, clear, not the kind that repeats itself. Tobias didn't answer, just watched, hands resting on his knees. His gaze like a door, neither inviting nor closed. The man gave a grin, not the smile of a victor, but the smirk of someone who thought everything had already been decided. "We've been tracking 10 women, 3 days, no stops. One of them's carrying something that belongs to us." Tobias remained silent, but something stirred in his chest. Slight, heavy as lead. Ayanna stepped out, not from the house, from the side of the stable. She held nothing, stood tall. Her eyes met the lantern light without flinching, without challenging. "No one here belongs to you," she said, slow, firm, steady. The man curled his lip. "Funny. I heard you're holding something that isn't yours." Ayanna said nothing. Tobias stood. Just one motion. But as he rose, the wind shifted. The man looked at him. "It's your house. I don't think you want to turn it into a place you can't stand in anymore." Tobias stepped down one stair. No threat, no theater, only words. "I don't think you want to walk into a place you don't understand." No one laughed anymore. No one replied. A truth hung in the air like the scent of powder before the match strikes. This wasn't about cornering a group of fleeing women anymore. They were standing before a house where someone had chosen not to turn away. Another shadow appeared behind the first soldier, younger, hand resting on a holster, not drawn yet. Tobias tilted his head. Ayanna stepped half a pace back, not from fear, but to signal behind her, the elders, the child, ready to retreat if they must. Tobias gave a nod. "I'll say it once. You turn around now. No one will follow. No one will speak." The soldier hesitated. The confidence he'd carried began to recede, like water pulling back when sand turns soft beneath it. "And if we don't?" he asked. Tobias looked him in the eye. "Then I'm no longer the one you get to talk to." The wind rose, not strong, not slamming the door, just enough to snuff half the flame of the lantern on the porch. In that moment, everyone saw clearly. This house wasn't a fortress, but Tobias's back, unmoving, unyielding, was the thing holding the storm outside. No shots were fired that night. The soldiers withdrew, not in panic, not looking back, but they left a promise. "We'll be back, with numbers." Tobias didn't answer, but he knew. Next time, there'd be no talk left to offer. When the door closed behind him, Ayanna placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time, not as a guest, but as an equal. The girl holding the child looked up at him. Didn't smile. Only held the baby tighter. And Tobias, he no longer felt like the owner of the house. He was the gatekeeper now, between what is right and what is easy. Between a door left open and a world that had forgotten too many quiet souls. That night the fire burned through till morning, not for warmth, but because no one wanted the house to slip back into darkness ever again. Ayanna didn't sleep, neither did Tobias. They sat facing each other, no discussion, no plans spoken aloud, because in their eyes everything had already been decided, just by being there. Tobias unrolled the old map of the land. The paper was thin, corners torn, but it still showed the footpaths, runoff ditches, old dry channels, and those narrow trails only he remembered, places where he had once buried solitude. Now those very places would become ways to live, not just places to hide. Ayanna studied the map, her finger pressing to the eastern ridge. If they skirt the edge, they'll arrive in 3 hours, but if they come straight, Tobias nodded. Then we've got 1 hour, and we need to be ready in half. He didn't raise his voice, didn't urge. He simply cleared a small space near the stove, where rusted tools and forgotten things had long gathered dust. From there he pulled out a rusted steel bear trap, teeth dulled but still sharp, a coil of rope once used for tying horses, a short steel pipe, enough to serve as a makeshift scope. The young woman, the baby's mother, stepped forward, child held tight to her chest. Her eyes weren't red, but the shadows beneath them looked like she'd aged a decade in one night. "I want to help," she said softly, her voice unbroken. Tobias looked at her. For a long time, not to say no, but to weigh something deeper, whether he still had it in him to trust someone enough to live alongside them again. At last, he nodded. He pointed toward the stove. "Pot of water, separate the blades, dry them, keep them sharp." Not a grand task, but the work of someone who belonged, no longer a guest. The older woman patched the cord at the back door. Ayanna gathered planks, ones still solid, to brace the window frames. No one said much, but everything they did was a way of telling Tobias, "If you choose to stay, so do we." The sky hadn't fully lightened, but night had begun to retreat. Tobias led the old horse from the stable, not to ride, but to let her scent what men could not. The mare nodded slowly, snorted, ears twitching forward, then turned her head to the north. That was where the wind had shifted, and where danger would come. Tobias returned to the house, lifted a floorboard beneath the hearth. Below it, a rusted tin box. Inside, Sarah's old pistol, a 6-shot Colt. The last bullet had never been fired. He wiped it clean with the hem of his shirt, loaded it, then laid it gently on the table in front of Ayanna. "If I fall," he began, but Ayanna cut him off. "You won't fall alone." The young mother wrapped the baby in a shawl, layered tight like armor spun from faith. Tobias watched, and for the first time he didn't see the child as a symbol of what had been lost, but as a chance not to be a nameless survivor. He stepped onto the porch. The wind carried the scent of iron. Far off, a long, low horn blew, not the call to charge, but a warning, "We're coming, and we expect you to step aside." Tobias didn't. He placed the rifle by the door, set his hand on the wood, the same wood he'd sealed shut during the coldest winter of his life, and whispered, for no one to hear, "This time I stay." The wind turned cold, not from the season, but from the kind of silence that always comes before a storm. Tobias planted the last trap spike near the wild plum trees. His hands trembled, not from fear, but because his pulse hadn't beat this fast since the day he lost Sarah. Ayanna stood behind him, watching the tree line. 3 other women crouched in the old stable, once meant for horses, now serving as a lookout post. No one believed they would win, only that they must not let evil pass through unchallenged. Near midnight, a rustling sound broke the dark, not loud, but sharp, like a blade slicing through still water. Tobias raised his hand. No shot, no retreat. He simply listened. He knew someone had stepped into a place where no one ought to stand. The first trap didn't snap loud, just a dry click, then silence, a grunt, a shuffle back. Tobias couldn't see the enemy clearly, only shadows moving between trees like snakes crawling through shattered moonlight. His first shot wasn't meant for a man. He aimed at the base of a tree, 3 steps beyond. The crack of the bullet tore through the night like it tore through belief in silence. The first soldier turned back, but 2 others had already crossed the broken fence. Ayanna shouted, "Left flank!" A blade sailed into the door. Tobias shoved the board aside. A splinter pierced his left hand. Blood soaked his sleeve, but he held his ground. His second shot struck a man in the shoulder, the one carrying a short-barreled pistol. He dropped into an old pile of ash, where the winter cook fire used to be. The young woman, the baby's mother, crouched behind the door. The child whimpered softly, but she didn't hush it. She only held him tighter, as if he were her last reason to believe in anything. One man kicked in the stable door. The older woman stood firm, shovel handle in hand. He laughed, smug, just before Ayanna struck from behind, driving a rock into his temple. Blood splattered the wooden wall, soaking into the rope once used to tether horses. Tobias heard a plank snap. He ran, without thinking, reached the porch, just as one man shoved Ayanna down. Tobias didn't raise a gun. He threw his whole body. They tumbled off the stone steps. Tobias drew a knife. The other was quicker, but the old man carried something time couldn't measure, a life with nothing left to lose. Blood spilled along his neck. His knee twisted, but Tobias blocked the door, and the child inside was still breathing. The fight didn't last long, just a held breath that finally shattered. 4 wounded, 1 dead, 3 ran, never looking back. Tobias lay in the dirt, eyes open, breath shallow, words gone. Ayanna lifted him, not with hands, but with a gaze that refused to let him slip. "You did it," she said, not loud, not soft, like a whispered prayer meant only for one soul. Tobias looked to the house, the baby in its mother's arms, the older woman wrapping Ayanna's hand. He didn't smile. He only nodded, like the last soldier reporting in, still standing. The next morning, sunlight brought no warmth, but the house no longer felt cold. Blood was wiped away with cloth steeped in herbs. Tobias's wounds were dressed, though no one could say how far he might still walk. Ayanna placed a hand on his shoulder, not to hold him, but to thank him, and he spoke, a single sentence after a night when he thought he might never speak again. "They used to call me useless, but now, at least I was used once more." That morning there was no ceremony. No townsfolk came to shake Tobias's hand. No wagons brought the curious. Only the scent of corn porridge drifting through smoke, the slow steps of cattle circling the broken fence, and desert sunlight slanting through the porch beams, casting trembling streaks of gold across the wooden floor. Ayanna tended the fire, her hands moving with the rhythm of someone who'd known many kitchens in the dust. Tobias sat in his old chair, white bandage wrapped around one hand, his gaze fixed through the window slats, where red dust curled in the wind like souls still searching for rest. No one spoke of the fight the night before. No one asked for the story. But in every glance, Tobias had become part of them, not a hero, but the man who stayed when every other door had slammed shut. The elder woman laid a patchwork blanket over his shoulders, not like a tribute, but like kin warming someone who had come through the longest night. The young mother brought the baby out to the yard, letting the sun touch its tiny face. The child didn't cry, just looked up at Tobias with wide, round eyes, as if to ask who he was, without knowing yet how to form the words. Tobias didn't smile. He wasn't used to it. He only nodded as if to say, "I'm here, and I stayed. For you." By midday, Ayanna held a rake, clearing the patch of earth by the porch where weeds once tangled with red soil. Tobias watched, said nothing, didn't look away. After a time, he rose, slow, his knee still aching, and pointed to a corner of ground. "This spot good for turnips," he said, his voice raspy like wind through sandstone. Ayanna looked up, and a rare smile flickered in her eyes. "You think you'll live to harvest?" "I think we ought to try." No one buried the attackers. They were left at the edge of the forest. No names, no goodbyes. Tobias placed an old plank beneath the pine tree, carved a few rough crosses into it, not to honor them, but to mark that this place had once been defended by the trembling hands of a man called Useless. On the third day, rain came. tapping on the tin roof like fingers telling old stories. Tobias lay in the small room, blanket pulled up to his chest, his breath slow, like desert wind in no hurry. Ayanna stepped in with a bowl of ginger tea, its warmth drifting like a healing song. He took it, no thanks needed, because between them words were no longer required. "You know," Ayanna said, her voice low like an Apache melody sung near riverbanks, "when I first saw you, I thought you only knew how to survive. Now I understand. Survival is how you protect what's good." That night they shared supper around the old wooden table. Mismatched bowls, a frayed tablecloth, but laughter soft when the baby sneezed into the porridge and nearly knocked over the pot. Tobias took a sip of water, looked around. The house was full of breath, and silence no longer felt like a blade cutting through his chest. Outside, under the porch, a new chair had been built, from scrap wood. Not pretty, but sturdy. The sixth chair, a sign that this place no longer belonged to just one man. A few weeks later, Tobias sat in the back room, his hand resting on Sarah's old notebook, eyes closed. Ayanna entered and saw the unfinished line, a poem about wind and sand. "Want me to keep reading?" she asked, her voice light as the old river songs. Tobias didn't answer, but his lips moved. So Ayanna read, not because he loved poetry, but because a life of loneliness sometimes only needs a voice nearby to last one more season. In the end, they didn't call him Mr. They called him Father, the shortest name, the nearest kind, like the way Apache travelers used to name the one who led them through moonless nights. No statue was raised for Tobias Redmont. No street bore his name. But in a house at the edge of the desert, a child grew up, holding a wooden doll carved with an eagle. And one day he would ask, who was he? And the answer would be a song without words, about a man once called useless, who kept goodness from being orphaned. The rain tapered off, leaving a fine mist clinging to the eaves like fog that didn't know how to vanish. Tobias's shack, if anyone still called it that, was nothing more than a sun-bleached huddle of wood pressed low beneath a sky sagging with cloud. The wind hadn't died. It whispered still, speaking in a language only the abandoned could understand. Tobias stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the iron latch, but not moving it. Inside, the stove gave off a soft, unsteady crackle, flame too weak to warm a man, but still burning. Out there, the dark was no longer black, blurred now because someone was standing in it. Not one, 10. Women, black hair, dusky skin, clothes soaked and wrinkled with rain. No guns, no banners, no declarations scrawled across their foreheads, only eyes looking straight ahead, tired, but not pleading. They made no show of sorrow. They weren't playing at pity. They stood and waited. The one in front stood a step closer, close enough that Tobias could hear the drip of rain from her hair to the porch boards. Her chin lifted, not in challenge, but as if to preserve the last edge of her pride. In the arms of a younger girl, 16 maybe, was a child wrapped in a torn blanket. It didn't cry, didn't stir, just breathed, like a coal still faintly lit. Tobias didn't remember opening the door. The thick pine door, which had held off storms and men alike, now stood wide, and he hadn't heard the hinges creak, only that when he stepped back, cold air hit his chest, but something heavy lifted from his shoulders. No one entered first. Ayanna, the woman in front, waited for Tobias's eyes. No gesture, no request, no "may we." She waited only to see if he would turn his back. And Tobias didn't. The fire flared when the wind swept in. The eldest woman leaned into the arms of the strongest. The girl carried the child. The rest stepped forward barefoot. Each step carried the scent of rain, of blood, of earth, and something harder to name. Survival. Tobias shut the door, but he didn't lock it. The house, empty for 8 years, now held 11 souls. The stove burned warmer, not from wood, but from the breath of living bodies. One woman took the pot, another wiped the floor with a frayed sleeve. No one asked the man of the house, "May I?" No one overstepped. They simply moved, as though they'd once known how to live and had been given somehow the right to live again. Tobias stood, arms slack at his sides like a guest in his own home. He didn't understand. He wasn't angry. He wasn't moved. He wasn't glad, just confused, because every small act of theirs echoed in him like the sound of a family once lost. The elder woman was laid on a blanket near the door. The young girl warmed the infant's hands by the fire. Ayanna removed her soaked coat, hung it near the stove, and sat. No complaint. No tears. She only sat, eyes fixed on the flames like someone who had watched too many things burn. Tobias poured coffee into the bowl that always waited on the windowsill. There was no one left outside, but he did it anyway, not from habit, but because for the first time someone had truly walked in. He set the bowl on the table. No invitation. No one drank. But everyone knew this house, though poor, though wounded, though haunted, had just opened its heart again. Tobias said nothing. None of them did. The little cabin, filled now with people who had never known one another, was so quiet you could hear the soft crackle of coals in the fire. Outside, the wind still howled, snaking through the eaves, dragging rain-soaked dust up the hillside. But inside, the world had gone still, not because of walls or shutters, but because of a shared silence, an unspoken agreement. No one needed to know each other's story. Not tonight. Breathing was enough. Tobias withdrew to the chair by the window, a cloth in hand, wiping down a gun that had already been cleaned the day before. Not to threaten, not to prepare, just because he didn't know what else to do with hands that trembled. Not from fear, but from living. Ayanna sat near the stove, eyes closed as if in meditation. Her eyes were deep, dark, unflinching. She wasn't watching Tobias. But she knew he was watching her, not with suspicion, but with something Tobias refused to name: respect. A young girl, long hair, shirt torn across the back, moved gently toward the corner of the room and picked up a broom that hadn't been touched in months. She didn't ask, didn't tiptoe. She swept slowly, softly around the old rug where Sarah used to sit and mend shirts. Tobias wanted to say don't, but no words came, because the way the girl bowed her head, as if she knew this space once belonged to someone now gone, left him without the strength to shatter that quiet reverence. Near the fire, the youngest woman held the child close, rewrapping it with the fold of her own shirt. The baby was no longer blue. It slept, not deep, not safely, but it slept. Tobias couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone sleep in this house, other than himself. No child had breathed under this roof since the night his daughter never woke from a winter fever. Now the soft breath of a child rose and fell, like the first bell toll calling him back to life. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the wind kept blowing. Smoke slanted from the stovepipe, carrying the scent of ash and damp hair. Tobias stood and stepped outside, not to check the ground, not to guard the property, but simply to breathe. He stood there a long while, looking toward the red dirt road, where the wind moved, as it always had. But this time he noticed something strange. He wasn't alone in it. The wind didn't welcome him, but neither was it an enemy anymore. When he came back in, the young woman returned the broom to its place. Ayanna looked at him for the first time since she'd entered. No thank you, no softness, just a look, the kind that carried 1,000 unspoken things. We know what it is to be left behind. And we won't do that to you. Not tonight. Tobias sat down again. He didn't speak. Neither did they. But in that silence, warm with breath and life, for the first time in 8 years, he didn't feel useless. No one called him anything. No one praised him. But in the flickering light, he knew he was being seen, not as the old cripple, but as a man quiet enough to make others feel safe. Before dawn, when night had run dry, but morning had yet to arrive, when everything hung suspended between no longer and not yet, Tobias's wooden cabin, for the first time, held enough souls to keep the fire burning without another log thrown in. 10 women. They didn't call each other by name. They didn't drape arms or whisper sentiment. Only glances passed flame to flame, through nods, hidden wounds, and the quiet strength it takes to hold steady for the one beside you. They didn't need him, didn't ask anything of him. But for the first time, Tobias added another log to the fire, before the embers begged for it. The young girl held the sleeping child, head resting against the wall. One hand hung loose, but still gently cradled the child's leg, as if afraid someone might steal it away from her, even in a dream. That small, trembling act kept Tobias from looking away. He'd seen his wife hold their daughter like that, even when the child had fallen into deep sleep, even when the cold no longer threatened, as though a mother knows the world is always ready to take back what it once gave. Ayanna had managed a few moments of rest. The older woman had restarted the fire, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon long since broken at the handle. No one in the cabin asked Tobias for anything, but every gesture honored the space he had offered. No one opened his cupboards, no one touched the gun corner, no one laid a hand on the small table where the empty porcelain bowl still sat. Tobias sat in the chair by the window, watching outside, not to keep watch, but because his chest held more now than he had words for. In 8 years, no one had entered this house without being asked. No one had left behind the scent of damp hair, the iron tang of blood, or the soft sound of a breath still fighting to exist. No one had entered without making him wish he could shut the door again. But this time, he hadn't closed it. A horse gave a low cry out by the stable, just one sound. But Tobias heard something in it that didn't belong. He stood, threw on his coat, and stepped out, not with a gun, just to the edge of the porch. The cold wind slapped his face, like a wordless accusation. Fresh prints marked the dirt road, horse tracks, not his, not theirs. Someone had passed through the night. When he returned, Ayanna was already awake. She looked at him, didn't ask, didn't pry, only nodded, as if they were now the only two in that house who understood. Tonight would not be quiet. Tobias crossed to the table, opened a drawer, unwrapped a cloth bundle. He opened the old wooden chest in the corner of the room, the one Sarah had once used to hide the things that mattered most. Inside were a box of unused bullets, a dagger, engraved with his wife's name, a candle, old and untouched, never lit. He placed them on the table, not rushed, not to boast, not as farewell, only so everyone in the room would know he had already chosen to stand with them before anyone had to ask. Ayanna stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder. No squeeze, no words, just a touch, as if passing on an unspoken trust. And for a moment, inside that smoky, threadbare cabin, Tobias Redmond, the man the town had once called useless, became the silent center of those who had survived, not for his strength, not for his weapons, but because he left the door open, when every other place had long since shut. That noon, the sky was dim, no rain, but no light either. The sun felt wrapped in wool behind thick clouds casting no shadows, only a faint warmth like buried coals under dust. Tobias stood before the horse stable, his hand stroking the mane of the old mare. the last one he'd kept since Sarah's time. The horse blinked slowly, pressed her head against his brow, a touch not of affection but of recognition between two creatures who had survived longer than they ever meant to. On the ground, fresh hoofprints still held shape, even with the wind dusting over them. Tobias knelt, no need to measure. One glance, and he knew, not civilian, not packhorse, military mounts. Stiff posture, short reins, feet trained for pursuit. 15 years ago, he'd trained those very horses, and it was horses like these that had dragged Sarah's body back from the edge of the forest. When Tobias returned to the house, he didn't speak a word, but Ayanna already knew. She stood by the window, hand resting on the crossbar lock. A woman who'd known the scent of ash longer than perfume, whose hands had sewn shirts and taken lives alike. She didn't fear, but she knew the cost of survival. Ayanna looked at Tobias. "You don't have to stay." The words came light as breath but heavy as reins, wrapped tight around a galloping throat. Tobias didn't answer. He walked to the table, opened the drawer that held his ammunition. One hand took the box, the other lifted a frayed cloth, wrapping the rifle grip the same way he had during the war. Not to kill, to keep his word, keep his people, keep himself from slipping back into the dark. The older woman boiled water, her hands trembling, but her eyes bright. The young girl checked the infant's wrap. Another woman redressed a wound on her arm, the blood dry since the night before. No one asked Tobias what he would do. No one questioned which side he'd chosen, because his actions had already answered. Tobias stepped out back, to the spot where he'd buried the ebony chest under dirt and stone. When he dug it up, his hands came out blackened, nails split, but his face was calm like a man pulling weeds. Inside the chest, a map of the old forest, drawn by his own hand. A tripwire trap, the kind he once used to slow soldiers in the brush. And a letter, unsent, written to his daughter, paper yellowed, ink blurred, but the first line still clear. "I'm sorry, little one." He didn't read it, just folded it carefully, tucked it into his left shirt pocket, the one closest to the heart. Evening came. No one ate, no one spoke. Only silence ticked through the cabin like a clock measuring down to something no one could name. Ayanna pulled the curtain. Tobias moved to the door, and for the first time in 8 years, he hung the lantern on the porch, not to guide someone in, but to tell those outside, someone in this house has chosen to stay. Not long after. Hoofbeats again, this time closer, not one, not two, 6. The crack of a whip, the laughter of men, a sharp voice, flat, cold, practiced. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. Tobias looked at Ayanna. Ayanna looked back. No one said, "It's begun." But both of them heard it echo in their chest, like a shot not yet fired that still made the ribs tighten. Inside the weathered wooden home, 10 women sat close. The child slept. The fire burned low, and at the threshold Tobias, once called the useless old man, stood straight, rifle in hand, heartbeat steady, eyes fixed on the sunset retreating from the land. He was no longer the man who watched the house. He was the man standing between what's wicked and what little good remained.